Beneath the shadow of towering mountains, one settler's simple mistake turned into the foundation of a revolutionary design, saving lives and cabins alike. In a world of harsh winters and constant danger, survival was often a matter of ingenuity, but some solutions, no matter how pointless, have the power to endure the test of time. Before we dive into this incredible story of survival and invention, tell us where you're tuning in from today. If tales of frontier perseverance inspire you, don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow's story could be just as unbelievable. Samuel Thompson stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching the early morning mist rise off the creek. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine, a quiet reminder of the wilderness that surrounded him, ever watchful. He could hear the wind beginning to stir, a soft hum that would soon become the roar of a storm. In the Rockies, that meant one thing: winter was coming. His cabin, little more than a crude structure built from the trees that surrounded him, seemed an extension of the wilderness itself. With its uneven logs, patched roof, and door barely holding onto its frame, it was a testament to his grit rather than craftsmanship. Still, it had kept him safe through 3 winters in these unforgiving mountains, and he trusted it. But deep down, Samuel knew that trust was fragile. Like the wilderness, it could turn on you without warning. The coming storm made him uneasy. Winters here were harsh, unrelenting. He had seen men die from the cold, or from a single misstep that could send them plunging into a frozen river or getting caught under a falling tree. There was something brutal in the silence of a snow-covered forest, where even the smallest sound could trigger an avalanche or draw the attention of a predator. A deep chill ran down his spine as he tightened his grip on the axe handle, deciding to check the roof one last time before the storm hit. Years of living in the wild had taught him that survival was not just about skill, but about preparation. Yet, in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that his cabin, the structure that had been his only protection in this untamed land, was not built to last. The cracks in the doorframe, the gaps in the roof, it was all too imperfect, too vulnerable. With a deep breath, Samuel turned his back on the wild and set to work, his axe biting into the logs. It was time to make his shelter stronger, just as the storm began to whip around him. As the wind howled louder, the doubts within him grew louder as well. This season would test more than just his survival skills. It would test the very limits of his ingenuity. The storm hit with a fury that night. Snow came down in sheets, swirling and howling as if the mountains themselves were trying to tear the world apart. Inside, Samuel sat near the fire, his face drawn and tired from the day's labor. The warmth from the hearth was a welcome relief, but it felt fragile, like the cabin itself. He glanced around the room, noticing the familiar gaps in the logs, the way the wind howled through cracks he hadn't noticed before. It didn't take a seasoned mountain man to know that his home was not nearly as secure as it needed to be. He couldn't shake the image of a bear prowling around his cabin from the previous winter. The thought of that massive creature testing the cabin's defenses, sniffing at the gaps in the logs, clawing at the door, it still haunted him. It was only luck that the bear hadn't found a way in, and that thought troubled him more than any storm ever could. What if next time wasn't so lucky? Samuel stood and walked over to the door, testing the frame. The wood creaked under his weight, and he noticed the faintest breeze blowing through the edges. His heart sank. The door, so crucial to his defense, was weaker than he had imagined. He ran his fingers along the edges, feeling the cold bite of the outside world seeping in. He had built this cabin with what he knew, what he had learned from years of experience in the mountains, but it wasn't enough. It was just a matter of time before something bigger and stronger would find its way in. He thought of his partner, Elias, who had died just the previous year from a bear attack. Elias had been a good man, a strong man, but even he hadn't been able to survive the savage cold and the dangers of the mountains. He had died when the very cabin they had built together failed to protect him. Samuel clenched his fists, the firelight flickering across his face as he stared at the door. He could almost hear Elias's voice in his mind. Survival isn't just about fighting the wilderness, it's about outsmarting it. That thought hit Samuel like a blow to the chest. The problem wasn't the cold, it wasn't the wild animals or the hostile tribes, it was the cabin itself. This structure meant to protect him had failed in its purpose. He couldn't let that happen again. The fire crackled softly as Samuel took a long breath, his mind already racing with ideas, plans, and possibilities. The cabin wasn't just a place to sleep, it was the difference between life and death. And it needed to be better. It needed to be unbreakable. Determined, Samuel set to work the next morning, his hands steady but his mind whirring with possibilities. He knew he didn't have the luxury of time. The winter would be here soon, and it was only a matter of time before his cabin would be tested once again. Samuel awoke early the next morning, the cabin still shuddering under the weight of the storm. The wind howled like a pack of wolves, and the snow outside piled up deeper with each passing hour. But inside, the fire was steady, casting a warm glow over the rough-hewn walls. Despite the warmth, a sense of unease had settled into Samuel's bones. He could not rest. His thoughts kept returning to the same troubling question. How could he reinforce his cabin in a way that would hold against the forces of nature and the wild animals that prowled the mountain? His mind turned to the trees around him. For weeks now, he had been collecting firewood and carefully observing the forest, but there was more to be learned from those trees than just firewood. He'd spent years using timber for the most basic purposes, building walls, doors, and roofs, but now he needed to look deeper, to see the strength and weaknesses hidden in each log. The previous day he had ventured into the woods, his boots crunching over the snow as he studied the trunks of the trees standing tall in the biting wind. One thing had become clear. There were patterns in nature that could help him. As he walked, he thought about the way trees were built, their sturdy, interlocking roots, their layers of bark that protected the delicate inner wood from the harsh weather. He had noticed the way the trees seemed to grow stronger in the face of adversity, their trunks standing taller against the storm, their branches swaying with a resilience that suggested deep strength. There had to be something he could take from that. It wasn't long before Samuel's mind began to form an idea. He began mentally mapping the way a tree's natural structure kept it intact under harsh winds, snow, and the weight of years. He needed to replicate that kind of strength in his cabin. It wasn't about adding more layers of wood or just covering up gaps. It was about creating a system where the logs themselves, the very foundation of the structure, could work together to resist external pressure. With that insight, he returned to the cabin and began to experiment. He started with the walls. The logs, though solid, had been placed without much thought for the angles of their interlocking. The gaps in between the logs were inevitable, but by using the interlocking patterns he had observed in the forest, he could create a stronger structure. Samuel began working through the night, shaping and fitting the logs together, trying to replicate the force-distributing techniques he had learned from the trees. The task was slow and painstaking, but as he worked, a sense of purpose grew inside him. This wasn't just a cabin anymore, it was a challenge, a test of his skills and determination. If he could make this work, he could make something stronger than any trapper had ever built. By morning, the storm had let up slightly, and the cabin stood in the center of a quiet, snow-covered wilderness. Samuel took a step back, wiping the sweat from his brow, and for the first time in days, allowed himself a moment to breathe. He could feel it. A change was coming. He wasn't just surviving in the mountains anymore, he was learning how to thrive. Winter's grip on the mountain was tightening. The days were shorter, and the nights longer, with the storm clouds gathering once again as if nature itself was pressing down on the small cabin Samuel called home. But inside, the walls felt sturdier. He had been working tirelessly, driven by a newfound resolve to change his fate and the fate of anyone else who might find themselves living in a cabin like his. By now, Samuel had made considerable progress. He'd worked through the night and day, refining the construction of the walls and securing every log with a care that was almost obsessive. Each log now locked into place with a strength that felt right. The corners, too, were taking shape. The traditional notched logs, which had always been a weakness in cabin construction, had been replaced with a new design, one that used a method he had seen used in stone buildings. The logs extended past the corners, and he used iron pins to secure them in place, eliminating the gaps and points of leverage where bears could pry the structure apart. But something was still missing. He was pleased with the progress of the walls, but the roof remained a glaring weakness. The simple bark and pole construction would not withstand the weight of another heavy snowstorm. He needed something more. Samuel spent the next few days collecting materials and searching the forest for anything he could use. He pulled out the map of his thoughts, visualizing how he could replicate the interlocking structure of a tree's branches and roots in his roof design. Trees, he knew, could handle the heaviest snowfalls because their roots spread out, absorbing the pressure and stabilizing the entire structure. He could build the same kind of system into his roof. He worked methodically, using the same principles he had employed in the walls. First, he carefully selected thicker, more robust logs for the ridgepole, cutting and shaping them until they fit perfectly. He then layered the logs in a criss-cross pattern, securing them with iron brackets that he had brought back from St. Louis. Each layer of logs was reinforced with a mixture of clay, horsehair, and pine resin, materials he had spent hours refining. The roof began to take on the solid, secure feel he had been hoping for. Samuel had learned to think beyond the immediate task. Each piece of the cabin was now connected in a way that would make it more than just a shelter. It would be a fortress. And that was the key. Survival wasn't just about sheltering from the elements. It was about building something that could withstand any threat the wilderness threw at it. As the snow continued to fall outside, Samuel worked through the night again, his determination growing stronger with each passing hour. He wasn't just building a roof, he was creating a foundation for the future, one that would endure long after the storms had passed. By the time the sun set on the following day, Samuel stepped back, sweat running down his face. The roof was finished. The cabin, once a weak and temporary shelter, now stood as a monument to his effort, his obsession. The work wasn't over, but the cabin had taken its first steps toward becoming something unbreakable. And as the storm raged outside, Samuel felt the first stirrings of hope in his heart. For the first time since that tragic winter with Elias, he believed that maybe, just maybe, he had created something that could withstand even the wildest forces of nature. Samuel stood in front of the cabin, hands on his hips, as the first flakes of snow began to fall. It had been weeks since he'd completed the last of his improvements, reinforcing the walls, adding layers to the roof, and creating a new door that would withstand the fiercest of attacks. But today the storm had arrived, and with it the ultimate test. The mountain was quieter than usual. The snow blanketed the forest like a soft, white silence, the kind that made the wilderness seem unreal, as if it could be suspended in time. But Samuel knew better. This quiet was only temporary. When the wind picked up and the trees began to creak under the pressure, the wild would return, and with it, the dangers that came with it. As he surveyed the cabin, Samuel's thoughts turned back to the years he had spent in the mountains, years where the weather had been both an ally and an enemy. He'd seen men's cabins torn apart by the forces of nature, their roofs collapsing under the weight of snow, or their doors splintered by the claws of a grizzly. In those moments, survival was more about the strength of one's shelter than any weapon one might carry. A cold wind howled through the trees, and Samuel felt the first sting of the biting cold that would define the coming months. His cabin was as ready as it would ever be, but the question remained, would it be enough? Without a second thought, he grabbed his rifle, checking the ammo as he stepped out into the snow. His boots crunched against the frozen earth, the snow already beginning to drift up against the walls of the cabin. Samuel walked around the structure, inspecting every corner, every gap, every edge that might have been overlooked in the frenzy of construction. His hands were cold, but his mind was sharp. This was a moment of reckoning. As he paced the perimeter, something caught his eye, a dark shape moving through the trees. At first it was just a silhouette, but as it drew closer, the size of the creature became apparent. It was a bear, a massive grizzly, moving through the snow with an eerie grace. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting this. The wilderness always tested a man's work, but the bear's appearance was not the moment he feared. It was the moment his cabin would be tested. The bear circled the cabin, its massive form moving around the structure with deliberate slowness. It sniffed the air, then approached the door, its claws scraping against the logs. Samuel's breath hitched as he crouched behind a tree, his rifle raised. He knew he couldn't shoot, not yet. This was a test, and he couldn't let panic dictate his actions. The bear pushed against the door with its massive body, testing the frame. The logs groaned but held firm. It swiped at the corners of the cabin, digging its claws into the chinking that Samuel had spent so many hours perfecting. Each time, the bear seemed to pause, as if unsure, before continuing its examination. The cabin held. For what felt like an eternity, the bear circled and pawed at the cabin, its frustration mounting with every failed attempt. But the structure remained unyielding. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the bear retreated into the woods, leaving the cabin standing strong and intact. Samuel exhaled deeply, his breath visible in the cold air. He had passed the test, but the relief was fleeting. He knew this was only the beginning. The winter would only grow harsher, and the wilderness would never stop testing his resolve. But for now, his cabin was safe, and that for Samuel was enough. The days that followed the bear's visit were filled with a quiet sense of triumph, but Samuel knew better than to let his guard down. The mountain was relentless, and the storm was far from over. Every morning he rose early, checking the cabin again, ensuring that the logs were still secure, the roof intact, and the door still standing strong. But even as he worked, the nagging thoughts lingered at the edges of his mind. His cabin had withstood the first test, but what about the next? He knew the wilderness well enough to understand that one test did not make a home impervious. There were other dangers, hungry wolves, freezing temperatures, and the harsh, unyielding snow that could bury everything. He had built this place with his own hands, but how long could it last? The answer, Samuel knew, was as long as he kept working at it. The wilderness didn't care about hard work, it cared only about survival. And he wasn't finished yet. The success of the cabin so far was merely a step in a longer journey, one that was defined not by the strength of wood and iron, but by the persistence of the man who built it. As the days wore on, Samuel continued to refine his work. He noticed things he hadn't before, the way the wind pushed at the corners, how certain spots of the cabin were more exposed to the elements than others. Each discovery drove him further into his obsession. Every flaw needed fixing, every gap needed filling. One evening, as he worked on the final touches of the roof, a thought hit him. What if all this work, all this effort, was for nothing? What if the next storm or the next bear would simply tear the cabin down? What if he wasn't enough? The weight of the question settled heavily on his chest. He had spent months working on the cabin, investing not just his time, but his heart and soul into it. And yet, even now, after all the adjustments, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was always one step behind the wilderness, always a little bit too late. That night Samuel sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The storm outside raged on, but inside he was still. The cabin had become both his sanctuary and his prison, and he was beginning to realize that survival was not just about shelter. It was about finding peace in the knowledge that you could never fully protect yourself from the wild. He had created something that was more than a structure. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to his willingness to face the wilderness head-on. But the price of innovation was steep. Samuel couldn't keep pushing himself forever. Eventually, the mountains would reclaim their own, and when that time came, he would need to accept the reality that no matter how strong the cabin, no matter how much effort he put into building it, he could never fully escape the wild. The storm raged harder than Samuel had anticipated. By the time the winds reached their peak, the cabin's thick walls groaned under the strain, but they held firm. The snow piled up against the windows, completely burying the doorframe and nearly blinding Samuel with the force of the gusts. Still, inside, the fire burned brightly, casting dancing shadows across the room. Samuel watched the flames flicker, his thoughts drifting far beyond the cabin, deeper into the wild, where each storm carried with it the threat of something much worse. The previous days had been spent in a near frenzy, adjusting, reinforcing, obsessing over every detail. Despite the success of the bear test, Samuel knew that his cabin could not yet be considered invulnerable. The raw power of the wilderness was always waiting just beneath the surface, ready to rise up at the most unexpected moment. Outside, the wind howled louder, and Samuel could hear the trees creaking under the pressure. A sudden crack sounded like thunder as one of the towering pines near the cabin snapped, falling with a crash into the snow. The ground seemed to tremble as the weight of nature pressed down upon the land. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. The storm was pushing the limits of everything around him, testing the very earth. Through the cold, wet window, he could see the snow drifting, an avalanche of white that seemed to bury the world outside. This was no longer just a battle with the elements. It was a war, one he wasn't sure he was winning. The thought crossed his mind. What if the work he had done, all the painstaking hours spent perfecting every log, every corner, every piece of his cabin, wasn't enough? Suddenly, he heard a loud thud. It was followed by another, and then a third. His pulse quickened. The sound was coming from the direction of the roof. The storm had brought with it more than just the weight of snow. It had unleashed its fury in the form of something far more dangerous, falling trees. Samuel grabbed his rifle and rushed to the door, but as he stepped outside, a wall of wind slammed into him, forcing him back into the cabin. He could barely see a thing, the storm was so thick. The thuds continued, growing louder, closer. His heart raced as the reality set in. Something was happening to the cabin. Without hesitation, he rushed to the back of the cabin, checking the integrity of the walls and the roof. As he rounded the corner, he saw it. A massive, gnarled pine had fallen across the roof, its heavy limbs pushing against the structure. The weight of the tree was immense, and Samuel could see the strain it was putting on the cabin. The logs were starting to crack under the pressure. His mind raced. If the tree shifted or moved any further, the roof would collapse, and everything he had worked for would be destroyed. The storm was too violent for him to fix it now, too dangerous to attempt any repairs. He had to wait, hope that the storm would pass without doing more damage. With a grim resolve, Samuel retreated into the cabin. The wind howled as it tore at the roof, but there was nothing he could do now except wait and pray. The storm raged for days. Each hour felt like a year, each minute stretching out as Samuel sat alone in his cabin, the walls groaning under the weight of the storm and the fallen tree. The relentless wind tore at the roof, and the snow piled higher, trapping him inside. His thoughts, once clear and focused on survival, had begun to wander, lost in a haze of fatigue and frustration. The storm had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It was as if the wilderness itself was trying to tear down everything he had built. And in a way, it was. The damage to the cabin was more extensive than he had feared. The tree had caused a significant portion of the roof to cave in, and the walls had buckled under the strain of the weight. For the first time since he had started building, Samuel faced the truth. No matter how much he had prepared, no matter how many hours he had spent reinforcing the cabin, the wild could always find a way to break through. He stood by the fire, staring at the flickering flames, lost in thought. The sacrifices he had made, the long hours, the obsessive attention to detail, it had all come down to this moment. The wilderness had claimed a part of him, just as it claimed a part of his cabin. But this wasn't just about the cabin. This was about survival. The storm had proven something Samuel had always known deep down. Survival wasn't just about building something strong. It was about learning how to adapt, to endure, to face the inevitable with grit and determination. This storm was a reminder that the wilderness had no mercy, that no matter how hard you worked, nature would always have the final say. Samuel thought about Elias again, his lost partner. He had been so sure of his own survival then, too. But in the end, Elias hadn't made it. The cold had taken him. And now Samuel realized that it wasn't just the strength of the cabin that mattered. It was the strength within himself to face the next challenge, whatever it may be. The storm had taken something from him, but it had also given him something he hadn't expected, a deeper understanding of his own limits. The wild was a force to be reckoned with, and survival was not guaranteed. He had learned that the hard way. The storm eventually passed, as all storms do. The wind died down, and the snow stopped falling. Samuel stepped outside, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. He looked up at the cabin, at the damage that had been done, and a strange sense of peace washed over him. The cabin had been tested, and it had faltered. But Samuel hadn't. He still stood, still breathing, still ready to face whatever came next. The wilderness was harsh and unforgiving, but it had not broken him. And that, he realized, was the true measure of survival. The sun had returned, but the damage was undeniable. Snow melted into slush, and the ground beneath Samuel's feet was soft with the remnants of the storm. His cabin, once a testament to his hard work, now stood in ruins, roof caved in, walls cracked, and the door barely hanging on its frame. The weight of the fallen tree had done more than damage the structure. It had broken his spirit momentarily. Samuel stood still for a moment, surveying the wreckage. The storm had taken what he thought was indestructible, proving that even his meticulous craftsmanship had limits. But deep down he knew the mountain wasn't finished with him yet. The storm had tested his resilience, his drive, his very sense of purpose. Now it was time to rebuild. With a deep breath, Samuel set to work. He cleared away the fallen branches, salvaging what wood he could. The ground was wet and the weather still unpredictable, but he couldn't waste time. His focus sharpened with each swing of the axe. The logs were heavy, but his hands were steady, each motion deliberate. It was the same process as before, but there was something different now, a quiet resolve. As he rebuilt the cabin, Samuel thought about the lessons he had learned. Strength wasn't just in the materials, the design, or even the preparation. It was in the refusal to give up when everything seemed lost. He wasn't just building a shelter anymore, he was building a legacy, piece by piece, each nail driven into the wood like a reminder of his endurance. The storm had not broken him. It had only made him stronger. By the time the cabin was finished, winter had already begun its slow retreat, giving way to the promise of spring. The rebuilding had taken weeks, but in the end, Samuel had crafted something even stronger than before. The logs fit tighter, the roof was sturdier, and every inch of the cabin exuded the quiet strength of a man who refused to yield. As he stood outside looking at the finished structure, Samuel felt a quiet pride. It wasn't the kind of pride that came from success, but rather from the journey, the lessons learned in the face of adversity. His cabin, his fortress, was more than just a shelter. It was a reflection of everything he had endured, of his willingness to confront the wilderness with his hands and his heart. Years would pass, the fur trade would fade, and the settlers would come. Samuel would move on, leaving the mountains behind for a quieter life, but the legacy of his cabin would remain. For generations, Others would find shelter in the strong walls he had built, just as he had. The wilderness had tested him, but he had left his mark on it, a mark that would stand the test of time. Samuel Bridger may have left the mountains, but his ingenuity would endure, etched into the logs of a cabin that would protect those who followed in his footsteps. In the end, it wasn't just survival that mattered, it was the legacy left behind.